The autumn wind moved through Ashworth Manor like a living thing, sighing through ancient corridors and rattling window panes that had witnessed 3 centuries of births and deaths, of power consolidated and secrets kept. Candlelight flickered in sconces along the east wing, casting shadows that danced across portraits of stern-faced ancestors, whose eyes seemed to follow the solitary figure, moving with practiced silence through the dimming halls. Eleanor Gray carried her duties like armor, each movement precise and measured as she tended to the evening's final tasks, straightening cushions in the drawing room that no one had disturbed, ensuring fresh candles stood ready in holders throughout the manor, her hands moving with the unconscious grace of 3 years' repetition. She was 23, though she felt centuries older, her youth worn thin by careful invisibility and the constant vigilance required of those who serve in great houses. The other servants had long since ceased to truly see her, which was precisely as Eleanor intended. She moved through Ashworth Manor like a ghost, present but unnoticed, essential but unmarked upon. Through the tall windows of the portrait gallery, she could see the last light bleeding from the sky, turning the manicured grounds into a study of greys and blacks, and somewhere in the manor's depths she could hear the steady rhythm of boot heels against marble, the Duke making his evening rounds. Sebastian Ashworth, 5th Duke of Ashworth, a man whose very name caused the servants to lower their voices and quicken their pace. Eleanor had heard all the whispers in the 3 years since her arrival, his ruthlessness in business, his cold dismissal of fortune hunters, his reputation for seeing through pretense with a gaze that could strip away lies like winter wind tears leaves from branches. She had observed him from careful distances, the set of his broad shoulders, when he stood at the library windows contemplating his lands, the barely perceptible tightening of his jaw when his mother, the Dowager Duchess, pressed him about marriage, the surprising gentleness in his hands when he handled the ancient books in his collection. Eleanor told herself that her observations were merely a servant's necessary awareness of her master's moods and movements, nothing more than the practical knowledge required to anticipate needs and avoid inconvenient encounters. Yet sometimes, in the quiet darkness of her attic room, she would find herself remembering the sound of his voice when he spoke to the estate manager, the particular way afternoon light caught in his dark hair, the rare moments when something almost like a smile would soften the severe lines of his face. She would catch herself in these thoughts and force them away with the firm hand of necessity, reminding herself that maids who forgot their place found themselves without positions, without references, without futures. Still, as she completed her rounds and prepared to retreat to the servants' quarters for the night, Eleanor paused at the top of the main staircase, drawn by some impulse she could not name, to look down into the grand entrance hall below, where the Duke stood, speaking with his steward, his face carved in shadows and candlelight, beautiful and terrible, and utterly beyond her reach. She watched for 3 heartbeats before turning away, pressing one hand briefly against her chest, where something ached with a longing she refused to acknowledge, then disappeared into the dimness of the servants' corridors, where she belonged. But before our lover's fate is revealed, subscribe so you never miss a chapter of romance and scandal. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? Now, let's begin. 3 years earlier, Eleanor Gray had arrived at Ashworth Manor on a morning when fog clung to the ground like despair made visible, carrying nothing but a small cloth bag and a letter of reference that bore a seal. She prayed no one would examine too closely. She had walked the final mile from the village on foot, her worn boots soaking through from the damp grass, her stomach hollow with hunger she had long since learned to ignore, and when the great house finally emerged from the mist before her, all stone and mullioned windows and centuries of accumulated power, she had felt something close to terror settle in her chest alongside the desperate hope that had driven her to this remote corner of England. Mrs. Dalton, the housekeeper, had studied her with shrewd eyes that missed nothing, taking in Eleanor's threadbare cloak, her too thin frame, the desperate politeness in her curtsy, and the older woman's expression had softened in ways Eleanor later learned were rare. The interview had been brief, Mrs. Dalton asking questions that Eleanor answered with carefully constructed truths that were not quite lies, and when the housekeeper finally nodded and said there was a position available for a housemaid willing to work hard and keep to herself, Eleanor had nearly wept with relief. It was during those first bewildering hours, as Mrs. Dalton showed her through the servants' corridors and explained the manners routines, that Eleanor caught her first glimpse of the Duke he had been crossing the entrance hall below as they looked down from the gallery, and even from that distance Eleanor had felt the force of his presence like a physical thing. He moved with the unconscious authority of those born to command, his tall frame clothed in severe black that somehow emphasized rather than diminished his stark beauty. And when he paused to speak to his steward, Eleanor saw the profile that would come to haunt her dreams: strong jaw, aristocratic nose, dark hair swept back from a broad forehead, and eyes that even from afar seemed to perceive too much. "Mrs." Dalton had noticed her frozen stillness and said quietly, "That is His Grace, the Duke. You'll have little cause to encounter him directly, but when you do, you keep your eyes down and your words few. He's a fair master, but does not tolerate impertinence or familiarity." Eleanor had nodded, understanding in that moment that she had fled from one form of danger into the vicinity of another, though this danger wore a different face and stirred feelings she had no right to harbor. In the weeks that followed, she learned the rigid hierarchy of the household, the butler and housekeeper at its apex, the ladies' maids and valets occupying elevated middle positions, and herself at the bottom among the housemaids and scullery workers, those whose labor maintained the grandeur that others inhabited. Her days began before dawn and ended long after dark, an endless cycle of scrubbing and polishing and carrying, tending to rooms she would never occupy, and maintaining comforts she would never enjoy. She was assigned to clean the library, a vast chamber lined with books in leather bindings, where she worked in the early mornings before the Duke began his day, moving silently among the volumes while dust motes danced in slanting sunlight, and she breathed in the scent of old paper and leather and the faint tang of tobacco that clung to everything the Duke touched. She tended to guest chambers that stood empty most of the year, their furniture draped in Holland covers like ghosts of past grandeur, and she polished silver in the butler's pantry until her arms ached and her reflection stared back at her from gleaming surfaces, showing a young woman whose eyes had learned to reveal nothing. Her own quarters were a small room in the attic, barely large enough for the narrow bed and wooden chest that constituted her entire world. The ceiling so low she could not stand fully upright near the walls, but it was hers, and it was safe, and in those first months that was everything. At night, lying on the thin mattress and listening to the sounds of the great house settling around her, the distant chime of clocks, the wind against ancient timbers, the soft breathing of other maids in neighboring rooms, Eleanor would sometimes hear footsteps in the corridor one floor below, the measured tread of the Duke, making his late-night rounds, and she would wonder what burdens kept him wakeful, what thoughts occupied a mind that commanded such wealth and power. What loneliness might exist in rooms filled with priceless things but empty of genuine companionship, and in wondering she would feel a dangerous sympathy take root in her heart, a tender concern for a man she had no business thinking of at all. The Duke's private study existed as a world unto itself, a sanctum of dark wood paneling and leather-bound volumes, where the scent of tobacco mingled with beeswax and the faint mustiness of ancient parchment. And it was here that Eleanor performed some of her most careful work, moving through the room each morning with the reverence one might show in a cathedral. Maps covered one wall detailed renderings of the estate's holdings, of distant properties in Scotland and Wales, and of shipping routes that connected the Duke's commercial interests across continents, and Eleanor would dust the frames with gentle precision, never pausing to examine them closely, though her eyes could not help but register the scope of power they represented. The massive desk that dominated the room's center bore evidence of late-night labor, correspondence in multiple languages stacked in neat piles, account books open to pages filled with figures in the Duke's bold hand, a decanter of brandy that was slowly diminishing as the nights grew longer and colder. Eleanor never touched the papers themselves, respecting the privacy of matters that were not her concern, but she could not help observing in peripheral ways the wax seals bearing noble crests, the urgency implied by certain underlined passages visible at the edges of documents, the way some letters seemed to weigh more heavily than others, as evidenced by their placement beneath crystal paperweights. On this particular morning, she was polishing the carved mantelpiece when she heard footsteps in the corridor, too early for the Duke's usual schedule, and before she could retreat, the door opened and he entered, stopping short when he saw her there. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second before Eleanor dropped her gaze appropriately, curtsying as she murmured, "Your Grace, forgive me. I had not expected I shall remove myself at once, but his voice stopped her movement. A moment, if you would. I seem to have misplaced a document, a letter bearing the seal of the Marquis of Silverton. Have you encountered it in your work? Eleanor's mind raced through her careful mental catalogue of the room's contents, and she responded quietly, I believe there is such a letter beneath the account book, on the side table near the window, Your Grace, and she watched from lowered eyes as he crossed to the indicated location and retrieved it, his movements betraying a weariness that sat strangely on his powerful frame. He stood there holding the letter, and Eleanor became acutely aware of the charged silence between them, the way the morning light caught in his dark hair and cast shadows beneath his eyes that spoke of insufficient sleep, the slight tremor in his hand as he reached for the brandy decanter at this hour, which struck her as both concerning and deeply sad. Thank you, he said finally, his voice carrying an undertone she could not quite decipher, something warmer than his usual clipped tones, yet still formal, still distant. You may continue, and Eleanor curtsied again, turning back to her work with hands that she willed to steadiness, even as her heart hammered against her ribs with an intensity that frightened her. She heard him settle into his chair, the rustle of papers, the scratch of pen on parchment, and she completed her duties with movements that felt mechanical, her entire awareness focused on the presence behind her, the sound of his breathing, the weight of a regard she imagined she could feel upon her back. Though when she risked a glance in the mirror above the mantel, his attention appeared fixed on his work. When she finally finished and escaped into the corridor, closing the study door with careful quietness, Eleanor leaned against the wall and pressed one hand to her chest, where her heart still raced, and she whispered fiercely to herself, Foolish, foolish girl, he is the Duke, and you are nothing. This path leads only to ruin. Yet even as she scolded herself, she could not forget the weariness in his eyes, the tremor in his hand, the unexpected gentleness in his voice when he thanked her, and she wondered what manner of burden could weigh so heavily on a man who commanded such power. What loneliness might drive him to seek solace in brandy at morning's first light, and what it might mean that she cared at all about the answer. Weeks passed and then months, the seasons turning as they always did at Ashworth Manor, summer's warmth giving way to autumn's melancholy beauty, and Eleanor found herself falling into rhythms that felt almost like belonging, though she knew such feelings were dangerous illusions for someone in her position. She learned the Duke's patterns through careful observation that she told herself was merely professional attentiveness. He suffered from insomnia that kept him pacing the corridors until the small hours, seeking solace in his study or the library when sleep eluded him. He preferred solitude to company, often taking his meals alone rather than enduring the social performances expected of his rank. And he possessed unexpected kindnesses that surfaced in unguarded moments. Like the afternoon Eleanor witnessed him speaking with old Thomas, the estate's gardener of 40 years, listening with genuine interest to the elderly man's theories about rose cultivation, his severe expression softening into something almost approaching warmth. Yet as autumn deepened, new tensions infiltrated the household's rhythms, whispered conversations among the upper servants that filtered down to Eleanor's level, like sediment settling in still water. The Dowager Duchess had begun a campaign to see her son married, inviting noble families to the estate with increasing frequency, parading eligible daughters before the Duke, with a determination that bordered on desperation. Eleanor found herself serving at dinners, where beautiful young women in silk and jewels conversed with practiced charm, their laughter like music designed to enchant, and she would watch from her position against the wall as the Duke responded with unfailing politeness that somehow conveyed absolute distance, his manner courteous but impenetrable, and she felt an ache in her chest that she had no right to feel, a hollow sensation that intensified each time she saw him bow over another lady's hand or lead another hopeful candidate through the conservatory. There was Lady Arabella Stanton, all golden curls and rose-petal complexion, who spoke 3 languages and played the pianoforte with skill that drew admiring applause. There was Miss Cordelia Blackwood, whose family's fortune rivaled the Duke's own, whose wit sparkled in conversation like champagne. There was the Honourable Miss Fitzwilliam, whose bloodline traced back to the Conqueror himself, whose every movement embodied aristocratic grace, and Eleanor watched them all, these women who belonged in the Duke's world as she never could, and told herself that the pain twisting in her stomach was merely indigestion from the kitchen's heavy fare. Mrs. Dalton noticed her distraction one evening as Eleanor botched the folding of linens for the third time, the older woman's shrewd eyes missing nothing as she said quietly, "A word of caution, my dear, from one who has seen much in her years of service. There are attachments that bring joy and those that bring only heartache, and a wise woman learns to distinguish between them before it is too late." And Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks as she protested perhaps too vehemently, that she harbored no inappropriate feelings, that she understood her place perfectly well, that Mrs. Dalton's concern was kind but unnecessary. Yet even as the words left her mouth, Eleanor knew they rang hollow, transparent lies that fooled neither woman, and that night in her narrow bed she acknowledged the terrible truth. She had developed feelings for the Duke that went far beyond admiration or respect, feelings that bloomed in her chest like thorns whenever she saw him, that made her treasure every brief interaction, as though gathering precious stones, that left her lying awake listening for his footsteps and wondering what manner of woman could reach past his careful defenses to touch the lonely man she sensed beneath the title and the power and the cold perfection of his aristocratic mask. The crisis descended upon Ashworth Manor on a grey October morning when the Dowager Duchess discovered that her emerald brooch, a family heirloom, passed down through 5 generations, worth more in sentiment than its already considerable monetary value, had vanished from her jewelry case, and within hours the entire household had been thrown into chaos as accusations flew and suspicions settled like ash upon everyone, particularly the newer servants who lacked the protection of long tenure. Eleanor found herself summoned along with the rest of the staff to the great hall, where they stood in anxious rows, while the Duke and his mother questioned each person with methodical thoroughness, and Eleanor watched the proceedings with a mixture of fear for her fellow servants and unwilling fascination at the Duke's approach to the investigation. Where the Dowager Duchess raged and threatened, her voice shrill with indignation and loss, the Duke remained calm and systematic, asking precise questions about movements and schedules, his sharp mind cataloguing information with the same attention to detail Eleanor had observed in his handling of estate business. Young William, a footman barely 18 who had joined the household only 3 months prior, became the focus of the Dowager's suspicions when someone recalled seeing him near her chambers the previous afternoon, and Eleanor witnessed the terror in the boy's face as he stammered denials, while the colour drained from his cheeks, his hands trembling so violently he could barely maintain his composure. But the Duke cut through his mother's accusations with quiet authority, pointing out that William had been carrying linens to the guest quarters at that hour as part of his assigned duties, that his presence in the corridor proved nothing. That presumption of guilt without evidence was both unjust and beneath their household's dignity, and Eleanor felt something shift in her chest at the unexpected defense, at the sight of power wielded not to crush, but to protect. The investigation continued through the day, each servant's quarters searched with apologetic thoroughness, the grounds examined, every possible location scrutinized, until finally a young maid named Sarah remembered that the Dowager had worn the brooch to the conservatory 2 days prior to show Lady Pemberton her prized orchids, and when they searched that location, they found the jewel caught in the lining of the cushioned bench where the Dowager had sat, having slipped from its faulty clasp, unnoticed. The relief that swept through the household was palpable, servants embracing and weeping with the release of tension. But Eleanor noticed that the Duke did not share in the celebration, instead retreating to his study with shoulders that seemed to bear additional weight, and later that evening when she passed his door on her rounds, she heard no sound from within and dared to peek through the partially open entrance. What she saw arrested her completely. The Duke sat at his desk with his head in his hands, the posture of a man utterly exhausted not merely in body but in spirit, and in that unguarded moment, Eleanor glimpsed the crushing burden of responsibility. He carried the weight of serving as arbiter of justice for so many lives, the isolation of making decisions that could destroy or save, the loneliness of power that permitted no weakness and offered no respite. She understood then with sudden clarity that beneath the cold exterior and the aristocratic reserve lay a man who cared deeply, perhaps too deeply, who felt the weight of every life entrusted to his authority, who defended a frightened footman not from abstract principle, but from genuine compassion, and this revelation transformed everything Eleanor had believed about him. cracking open the careful distance she had tried to maintain and allowing something dangerous and tender to flood into the spaces where only fear and propriety had dwelt before. Winter descended upon Ashworth Manor with the inevitability of fate, transforming the estate into a realm of crystalline beauty, where frost etched intricate patterns upon windowpanes and snow blanketed the grounds in silence that felt both peaceful and isolating, and with the season's arrival came changes in the household's rhythms. As servants drew closer together for warmth, their work concentrated in smaller spaces, their interactions more frequent and intimate in ways that summer's expansiveness had not required. Eleanor found herself assigned new duties that brought her into the Duke's orbit with unsettling regularity. Mrs. Dalton instructed her to bring late-night tea to his chambers when he worked through the darkest hours, explaining that the previous maid assigned to this task had departed to care for an ailing mother, and though Eleanor's heart seized with something between terror and anticipation at the prospect, she accepted the assignment with outward composure while her inner world tilted dangerously. The first night she knocked softly on his chamber door, balancing the silver tray with hands that trembled slightly, and when his voice called her to enter, she found him at his desk surrounded by papers and ledgers, his profile illuminated by candlelight that carved shadows beneath his cheekbones and revealed the weariness etched around his eyes. And he glanced up as she set the tea service beside him, with a slight nod of acknowledgement that somehow felt more meaningful than elaborate thanks. This became their pattern through the deepening winter, Eleanor appearing each night near midnight with tea that grew cold more often than not, while the Duke remained absorbed in his work, and she learned to read his moods in the subtle language of his posture and movements, the tight set of his shoulders when estate matters troubled him, the rhythm of his pen across paper varying between swift certainty and hesitant consideration, the particular books he reached for reflecting whether he sought distraction or deeper contemplation. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, their interactions evolved beyond the wordless exchange of service rendered and acknowledged, beginning with brief words of thanks that expanded into comments about the weather's severity or the lateness of the hour, observations that required no response, yet invited connection if Eleanor chose to offer it, and she found herself lingering fractionally longer each night, her replies growing from murmured agreement to tentative observations of her own. One evening when snow fell so heavily that the world beyond the windows disappeared into white darkness, the Duke remarked that the storm reminded him of winters from his childhood, when the manor felt like an island cut off from civilization, and Eleanor dared to share a memory of her own about sledding down hills that seemed mountain-tall to a child's perception, and for a moment the distance between Duke and servant dissolved into simple human connection before Eleanor caught herself and retreated with hasty courtesy. She treasured these midnight encounters while simultaneously fearing them, knowing each conversation carved her heart more deeply toward attachment that could bring only pain, yet unable to resist the gravitational pull of his presence, in the way her entire day oriented itself around those late hours when she might see him and exchange words that felt weighted with meaning she dared not examine too closely. Then came the night that changed everything, an evening in late January when she arrived to find him staring at the fire rather than working, his expression distant and troubled, and when she set down the tea he looked at her directly for the first time in all their encounters and asked, "What is your name?" A question that struck Eleanor with the force of revelation, because surely he must know it, must have known it for months, and yet he asked as though the answer mattered beyond mere identification, as though he wished to hear her speak it herself, to claim her own identity in his presence, and Eleanor felt the room tilt as she whispered, "Eleanor, Your Grace," watching something flicker in his eyes that she could not name, but that made her pulse race with a hope more dangerous than any fear she had ever known. That night Eleanor lay sleepless in her narrow bed within the servants' quarters, listening to the ancient manor settle around her with its familiar creaks and whispers, and when she could bear the tumult of her thoughts no longer, she rose and retrieved from its hiding place, beneath a loose floorboard, the small silver locket that represented all that remained of her former existence, the delicate chain cold against her fingers as she opened the clasp to reveal the miniature portraits within. Her mother's gentle face painted in careful detail, her father's stern but loving expression, frozen in happier times, before everything had shattered into irretrievable fragments. Eleanor Grey was not truly Eleanor Grey at all, or rather she was Eleanor but not Grey. She had been born Eleanor Charlotte Fitzwilliam, only daughter of Baron Fitzwilliam of Rosewood Estate, raised in privilege and comfort with the expectation of making a suitable marriage to some gentleman of appropriate station. Her childhood filled with music lessons and literature and the refined pursuits deemed proper for a young lady of quality, and she could still remember the weight of silk gowns and the glitter of candlelight at balls where she had danced without knowing how precious and fragile such moments were. The disgrace had come swiftly and completely when her father's business partner absconded with their joint investments, leaving behind forged documents that implicated the Baron in schemes of fraud and embezzlement. And though her father proclaimed his innocence with increasing desperation, society had already rendered its verdict. Creditors had descended like vultures. Former friends had turned away with cold eyes and colder shoulders, and within 6 months the estate had been seized, their possessions sold, their name dragged through scandal sheets that delighted in the fallen mighty. Eleanor's mother, a delicate woman whose constitution had never been robust, had withered under the weight of shame and loss, taking to her bed with a grief that consumed her from within, until fever claimed what heartbreak had already destroyed, and Eleanor had knelt beside that deathbed, holding a hand grown thin and translucent, while her mother whispered apologies for failing to protect her daughter from the cruelty of their reduced circumstances. Her father had survived his wife by mere weeks before disappearing into voluntary exile somewhere on the continent, leaving Eleanor a letter that spoke of his innocence and his inability to bear watching his daughter suffer for his misfortunes. And in that letter, he had pressed upon her the necessity of concealment and of taking a different name and finding honest work far from those who might recognize her and either exploit her vulnerability or condemn her by association with his alleged crimes. Eleanor had chosen service not from any romantic notion, but from pure survival instinct, understanding that a maid could disappear into the invisible masses of working people, that no one looked closely at servants' faces or inquired into their histories beyond the barest references, and Mrs. Dalton's kindness in accepting her despite the thinness of her credentials had been the first mercy Eleanor had known in months of grinding desperation. For 3 years, she had maintained this careful erasure of her former self, speaking in the deferential tones of service rather than the cultured accent of her upbringing, keeping her eyes downcast and her presence unremarkable, living in constant fear that someone might recognize the Baron's daughter beneath the maid's plain dress and mobcap, certain that discovery would mean dismissal at best and exploitation at worst, for she knew what became of disgraced gentlewomen without protection in a world that viewed them as fallen creatures deserving of their fate. The Duke's question, "What is your name?" had shaken her precisely because it suggested he saw her as more than a faceless servant, that he perceived some individual identity worth knowing, and this recognition terrified Eleanor because it threatened the invisibility that had become her only shield against a hostile world. Yet it also awakened something she had thought dead within her, some remnant of the girl who had once believed herself worthy of being known and valued for herself rather than her usefulness. She tucked the locket back into its hiding place with hands that trembled, reinforcing her determination to maintain the boundaries that kept her safe, to resist the dangerous pull toward the Duke that grew stronger with each midnight encounter, to remember that Eleanor Fitzwilliam had died with her parents, and only Eleanor Grey remained, and Eleanor Grey was a maid who had no right to anything beyond the security of her position and the small comfort of knowing she had survived when survival had seemed impossible. The announcement came on a grey February morning when the Dowager Duchess arrived at Ashworth Manor in a flurry of imperious energy and elaborate plans, declaring that a grand ball would be held within the month to properly introduce her son to the eligible young ladies of the finest families, her tone brooking no argument despite the Duke's visible reluctance, and the household erupted into controlled chaos as preparations began in earnest. Eleanor found herself working 16-hour days alongside the other servants, polishing silver that had not seen use in years, beating dust from ancient tapestries, scrubbing floors until they gleamed, transforming the manor's grand ballroom from a shadowed space of disuse into a glittering chamber worthy of the aristocracy's most discerning scrutiny, and she moved through these tasks with mechanical efficiency, while her heart grew heavier with each passing day, knowing that this spectacle existed solely to facilitate the Duke's marriage to some suitable lady of quality. The contrast between the two worlds, the one she inhabited and the one she served, had never felt more pronounced than during those weeks of preparation, as Eleanor witnessed the invisible architecture of labor that sustained aristocratic leisure. The cook and her assistants working through nights to perfect elaborate dishes, the footmen practicing their choreographed service until their movements achieved balletic precision, the maids stitching and mending and arranging flowers with cramped fingers and aching backs, all so that the nobility might dance and dine in effortless elegance, without ever considering the army of hands that made such elegance possible. On the night of the ball, Eleanor, dressed in her best servant's uniform, the plain black dress and crisp white apron that marked her as part of the manor's functioning machinery rather than its ornamental guests, and she took her position among the servants assigned to circulate through the crowds, offering refreshments, her eyes downcast as she had trained them to be, her presence deliberately forgettable. Yet despite her best efforts at invisibility, Eleanor found her gaze drawn repeatedly to the Duke as he moved through the prescribed rituals of the evening, dancing first with the Dowager Duchess as tradition demanded, then with a succession of young ladies who smiled and curtsied and deployed their various charms with the calculation of generals planning campaigns. And he executed his part in this matrimonial theatre with the same distant politeness Eleanor had observed in all his social interactions, his expression pleasant but unengaged, as though he watched the proceedings from some internal remove. She saw him partner with Lady Margaret Hastings, whose golden curls and porcelain complexion drew admiring glances from every corner of the ballroom, then with the dark-eyed daughter of the Marquess of Pembroke, whose wit was legendary, then with half a dozen others whose beauty and accomplishments blurred together in Eleanor's vision until she had to look away from the pain of watching the inevitable unfold. But then, during a moment when Eleanor passed near the ballroom's entrance carrying a tray of champagne glasses, she felt the weight of observation and looked up to find the Duke's eyes fixed on her across the crowded room, his gaze finding hers through the press of bodies and candlelight and swirling dancers, and for 3 heartbeats that felt suspended outside of time. They stared at each other with an intensity that seemed to Eleanor both terrifying and inevitable, the rest of the ballroom fading into insignificance, until she broke the connection with a sharp turn that nearly upset her tray, and fled down the servants' corridor with hands that trembled so violently she had to set down her burden before she dropped it, her heart hammering against her ribs as she pressed her back against the cool stone wall and tried to breathe past the recognition that whatever existed between them had just been acknowledged in a way that could not be undone. The morning after the ball arrived grey and weary, the manor seeming to exhale in collective exhaustion as servants moved through rooms that still bore evidence of the previous night's splendor, champagne glasses abandoned on side tables, wilted flowers drooping in their elaborate arrangements, the ballroom floor scuffed from hundreds of dancing feet, and Eleanor found herself assigned to the Duke's private study, where the gentlemen had retired after the ladies departed, the air still thick with the ghost of cigar smoke and brandy. She worked methodically through the debris of masculine conversation, emptying ashtrays and collecting glasses, straightening furniture displaced by late-night debates about politics and hunting and whatever else occupied the minds of men born to privilege. And on the Duke's massive desk, she discovered a leather-bound guest book left open to pages filled with elegant signatures from the finest families in England, each name a declaration of aristocratic lineage and social standing, and beside this register of nobility lay several sheets of the Duke's own writing, his distinctive hand immediately recognizable to Eleanor, who had dusted around his correspondence often enough to know the particular slant of his letters. She knew she should not read what was clearly private, yet her eyes moved across the page before conscious thought could prevent them, and she found herself looking at what appeared to be evaluations of the previous night's eligible young ladies, each name followed by observations rendered in prose as clinical and detached as a naturalist cataloguing specimens. Lady Margaret noted for beauty but vapid conversation, the Marquess's daughter intelligent but calculating, Miss Hartwell pleasant but lacking spirit, each assessment ending with the same devastating conclusion marked in the Duke's careful script, unsuitable. Eleanor felt an unexpected wave of sadness wash through her as she stood holding these pages that reduced living, breathing women to mere lists of qualities weighed and found wanting, and she understood with sudden clarity that the Duke was as trapped by his circumstances as she was by hers, perhaps more so, for while she had chosen invisibility as survival, he had been born into visibility that demanded he marry appropriately and produce heirs and fulfill obligations determined before his birth, and the loneliness of such an existence struck her with force that made her chest ache. She was carefully replacing the papers exactly as she had found them when the door opened and the Duke entered, his appearance shocking in its disorder, his evening clothes rumpled and his cravat loosened, dark circles beneath eyes that spoke of sleeplessness, his hair disheveled as though he had run his hands through it repeatedly. And he stopped upon seeing her with an expression Eleanor could not entirely read, though weariness was certainly part of it. The silence stretched between them, weighted with the memory of their locked gazes across the crowded ballroom, with all the careful distance they had maintained, now feeling suddenly impossible to restore. And then the Duke spoke in a voice rough with exhaustion and something else, something that sounded almost like desperation. "Did you find last night's spectacle as tiresome as I did?" The question hung in the air between them, intimate and unexpected, an invitation to honesty that violated every protocol of master and servant, and Eleanor felt her heart begin to race, because this was the first time he had initiated conversation beyond necessity. The first time he had asked her opinion as though it mattered, as though she were a person whose thoughts held value rather than simply another piece of the household machinery, and she knew that how she answered would either restore the proper distance between them or shatter it entirely, and God help her, she did not know which outcome she feared more. Spring arrived at Ashworth Manor with the gentle insistence of renewal, transforming the estate grounds from winter's stark severity into a landscape of tender possibility, and Eleanor found herself increasingly assigned to outdoor tasks, as the household emerged from months of interior confinement, polishing windows thrown open to admit fresh air, beating rugs in the courtyard where sunlight played across ancient stones, tending to the conservatory where early bulbs pushed determinedly toward light. And it was during these outdoor duties that she began noticing the Duke walking the gardens in the early morning hours before the household fully woke, his tall figure moving along gravel paths, still damp with dew, his hands clasped behind his back in an attitude of contemplation that seemed both lonely and peaceful. Their paths crossed with increasing frequency, encounters that at first seemed coincidental, but gradually took on the quality of intentional choreography, as though both were unconsciously arranging their movements to intersect in those liminal hours between night and day, when the world belonged only to those awake to witness it. And they developed a pattern of brief exchanges that felt safer than the charged silence that had followed his intimate question after the ball, discussing neutral topics with the careful courtesy of diplomats navigating delicate negotiations. The progress of the roses Eleanor was helping the elderly gardener prune, the new fountain being installed near the south terrace, books Eleanor had noticed in the Duke's study and dared to mention having read in her former life, though she never revealed the circumstances of that reading. Eleanor observed the Duke's gradual unbending in these morning encounters, the way his severe expression softened fractionally when he saw her approaching with her gardening basket, and the manner in which his shoulders lost some of their rigid set when they spoke of subjects that required no pretense, and she found herself struggling with her growing attachment even as she recognized its danger and futility, for what possible future could exist for a Duke and a maid, regardless of how many pleasant conversations they shared among the blooming lilacs and early roses. One morning in late April, when the air carried the promise of summer and the garden seemed to hum with green life, Eleanor was cutting flowers for the morning rooms when a sudden spring rain arrived without warning, transforming the gentle morning into a torrent that sent her running for shelter, and she found herself racing toward the garden folly, a small octagonal structure of white stone and climbing vines that offered the nearest refuge, only to discover that the Duke had sought the same sanctuary and now stood inside the open-sided pavilion, watching rain sheet across the landscape with an expression of such unguarded vulnerability that Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. The intimacy of the enclosed space pressed them closer than propriety allowed, the sound of rain on the folly's copper roof creating a curtain of sound that isolated them from the world beyond, and Eleanor was acutely aware of the Duke's presence beside her, the scent of his cologne mingling with rain-washed air, the rise and fall of his breathing, the tension in his posture that suggested he was as conscious of their proximity as she was, and the charged silence between them grew heavy with accumulated longing and unspoken words, until Eleanor felt she might shatter from the weight of it. The Duke turned to her then, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her heart hammer against her ribs, and he opened his mouth as though to speak words that had been building in him for months, his hand rising slightly as if he might reach for her, but then something in his expression shifted, some awareness of the impossibility of their circumstances reasserting itself, and he stopped, the words dying unspoken, and Eleanor could not bear it, could not endure one more moment of this exquisite torture of nearness without consummation, of desire acknowledged but unfulfilled, and she fled without a word, running through the rain back toward the servants' entrance, with her heart breaking and her dress soaked through, leaving the Duke standing alone in the garden. Folly watching her retreat through the silver curtain of spring rain, with an expression of such profound sadness that if she had seen it she might have turned back, but she did not turn back, she only ran. Eleanor appeared at Mrs. Dalton's sitting room the following morning, with shadows beneath her eyes that spoke of sleepless hours, and a request delivered in a voice carefully stripped of emotion, asking to be reassigned away from the Duke's chambers and private areas, claiming that the work had become too physically taxing given her other responsibilities, and Mrs. Dalton regarded her with eyes that had seen 3 decades of household dramas and missed very little, her expression kind but knowing as she studied Eleanor's face for a long moment before nodding slowly and granting the request without asking the questions that clearly hovered on her lips, understanding perhaps that some truths were too dangerous to speak aloud even in the privacy of the housekeeper's domain. Eleanor threw herself into her new duties with almost desperate industry, accepting assignments in the farthest corners of the manor, polishing silver in the butler's pantry, scrubbing floors in unused guest chambers, organizing linens in storage rooms where dust motes danced in shafts of sunlight, and she could work for hours without encountering anyone of consequence, rebuilding the walls of invisibility that had kept her safe for 3 years, attempting to resurrect the careful distance she had maintained before spring mornings and garden conversations had dismantled her defenses. Yet the Duke seemed to appear wherever she worked, with a frequency that defied coincidence. His tall figure materializing in doorways when she dusted the library's upper shelves, his footsteps echoing in the conservatory when she tended to plants that required careful pruning, his presence haunting the portrait gallery during her afternoon rounds when she cleaned the gilt frames of his ancestors who stared down with expressions that seemed to judge her presumption, and these encounters were wordless now, heavy with things unsaid, neither of them attempting conversation, but unable to ignore the charged atmosphere that crackled between them like summer lightning preceding a storm. Eleanor felt his eyes following her movements, felt the weight of his unspoken questions pressing against the silence, and she kept her own gaze carefully averted, focusing on her tasks with single-minded intensity, while her heart hammered traitorously in her chest, and her hands trembled so badly she had to pause occasionally to steady them, and she knew he noticed these small betrayals of her composure, just as she noticed the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides as though restraining himself from reaching for her, the barely audible sigh that escaped him when she would curtsy briefly and flee to another part of the manor. The other servants began to notice the strange dance between Duke and Maid, conversations falling silent when Eleanor entered rooms, sidelong glances exchanged in the servants' hall, whispers that followed her through corridors like autumn leaves stirred by wind, and she felt the weight of their speculation pressing down on her, knowing that her attempts at discretion had failed, that the household had marked her as somehow different, somehow noteworthy, and this visibility terrified her more than anything because it threatened the anonymity that had been her only protection. Mrs. Dalton summoned Eleanor to her sitting room on a grey afternoon when rain drummed against the windows and the manor felt close and oppressive, and the housekeeper's expression was grave as she gestured for Eleanor to sit, then spoke with the directness of someone who had delayed difficult words as long as conscience would allow, warning Eleanor about the impossibility of situations where hearts crossed boundaries they were never meant to traverse, recounting stories of servants who had lost everything, pursuing foolish dreams of love above their station, young women dismissed without references, forced into desperate circumstances, their lives ruined by moments of weakness or hope, and Eleanor listened with her hands folded tightly in her lap and her eyes fixed on the carpet's worn pattern, while Mrs. Dalton's words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples of fear and resignation. Eleanor knew the warning was wise, knew that everything Mrs. Dalton said came from genuine concern and hard-won understanding of the world's cruelty toward those who defied its rigid structures. Yet even as she nodded and murmured appropriate gratitude for the counsel, she felt something rebellious stirring in her chest, some part of her that had tasted possibility and could not quite relinquish it, despite knowing that such hope was dangerous, perhaps fatal to whatever small security she had managed to build in this household, and her heart no longer listened to wisdom, no longer heeded the sensible voice that counseled self-preservation above all else, because the Duke's almost words in the garden folly had planted seeds that refused to stop growing, despite the barren soil of impossibility in which they struggled to take root. The turning point arrived with the visit of Lord Pemberton, an old friend of the Duke's late father, who descended upon Ashworth Manor with the bluster and entitlement of a man accustomed to being welcomed everywhere regardless of whether his presence was actually desired, his arrival announced by the clatter of his carriage wheels on gravel, and the booming voice that carried through the entrance hall demanding refreshment and declaring his intention to stay at least a fortnight. And Eleanor first encountered him when she was summoned to serve at the dinner party held in his honor, moving through the formal dining room with a decanter of wine, while candlelight gleamed off silver and crystal, and the conversation flowed with the looseness that came from too much drink and too little restraint. Lord Pemberton held court at the table with stories that grew progressively louder and less coherent as the evening progressed, his face flushed and his words slurring slightly as he reminisced about the Duke's late father and the old days of their youth. And Eleanor moved quietly around the periphery, performing her duties with the invisibility she had perfected, refilling glasses and clearing plates, while the gentleman's conversation washed over her like a tide she had learned not to notice, until Pemberton's voice suddenly cut through her careful detachment with words that turned her blood to ice. "Remember old Baron Grey, and that nasty business with his estate, the scandal that brought down the whole family, the debts and accusations of fraud, his poor wife dead of shame, and the daughter vanished into God knows what fate, probably ended up in some brothel or worse given what happens to gently bred girls with no protection and no prospects." Eleanor's hands trembled so violently that the wine decanter nearly slipped from her grasp, the crystal shaking audibly as she stood frozen behind Lord Pemberton's chair, while the room seemed to tilt and spin around her, and she felt the Duke's gaze snap to her with the force of a physical touch, his eyes finding hers across the candlelit table with an intensity that confirmed what she had most feared, that Pemberton's drunken reminiscence had connected her present to her past in a way that could not be undone, but she could not meet the Duke's eyes, could not bear to see judgment or pity or recognition in that penetrating gaze, and she set down the decanter with hands that shook and fled to the sideboard, where she stood with her back to the table, struggling to compose herself, while the conversation mercifully moved to other topics. The dinner concluded with the gentleman retiring to the Duke's study for brandy and cigars, while Eleanor and the other servants cleared the remains of the meal, and she was gathering soiled linens in the now empty dining room when she became aware of a presence too close behind her, and she turned to find Lord Pemberton blocking her path to the servants' door, his bulk filling the doorway and his eyes moving over her with an assessment that made her skin crawl, and he reached out to touch her cheek with fingers that reeked of tobacco, while his voice dropped to what he clearly imagined was a seductive tone, saying that she was far too pretty to be wasting herself in service, that a girl with her looks could do much better for herself with the right protector, that he could make arrangements if she was interested in improving her circumstances, and Eleanor stepped back, with her heart pounding and her mind racing through possible escape routes, while Pemberton advanced with the confidence of a man who had never been denied anything he wanted. Before Eleanor could formulate a response or attempt to push past him, the Duke appeared in the doorway behind Pemberton with an expression of such cold fury that the temperature in the room seemed to drop, his voice cutting through the charged silence with words clipped and sharp as shattered glass. "Lord Pemberton, I believe you have mistaken your location and your welcome. You will retire to your chambers immediately, and you will depart Ashworth Manor at first light. Your continued presence here is no longer desired or tolerable." Pemberton sputtered protests about old friendships and misunderstandings, but the Duke's expression brooked no argument, and the older man retreated with wounded dignity and muttered complaints about young men who had forgotten proper hospitality, leaving Eleanor alone with the Duke in the candlelit dining room, where the remnants of the evening's excess still littered the table like evidence of civilization's thin veneer. The Duke approached her slowly, as one might approach a frightened animal, and his voice when he spoke had lost all its earlier ice, replaced by a gentleness that nearly undid her completely. "Are you unharmed, Eleanor? Did he hurt you? Tell me truly, and I will see that he answers for any offense." Eleanor shook her head mutely, not trusting her voice, and the Duke studied her face with concern that felt too intimate, too knowing. And she understood that Pemberton's words about Baron Grey had not gone unnoticed, that the connection had been made, that her carefully constructed anonymity had shattered like the crystal she had nearly dropped, and she could not bear the weight of his gaze, or the kindness in his voice, or the way he stood so close. She could feel the warmth radiating from his body, and so she did what she had done in the garden folly. She fled without a word, rushing past him and through the servants' corridors to her tiny room, where she sat on her narrow bed, with her hands pressed to her mouth to stifle the sobs that threatened to escape, and she knew with terrible certainty that her time at Ashworth Manor had come to an end, that she could not remain now that Lord Pemberton's drunken reminiscence had exposed the truth she had guarded so carefully, and so, with trembling hands and a breaking heart, she began making quiet preparations to leave before dawn. Before she could be dismissed, before she had to see judgment or pity in the Duke's eyes, gathering her few belongings and composing in her mind the words of explanation she would leave for Mrs. Dalton, planning her escape from the only sanctuary she had known in 3 years of exile and fear. Eleanor moved through the pre-dawn darkness of her small room with hands that trembled as she gathered her few belongings, folding the worn dresses that had served her through 3 years of service, tucking the precious locket that held her parents' portraits into the deepest pocket of her traveling cloak, composing in her mind the words she would write to Mrs. Dalton explaining her sudden departure with lies about a sick relative or urgent family matter, anything that would allow her to leave with some shred of dignity before the inevitable dismissal came, and she had just finished tying her bundle when a soft knock sounded at her door with a rhythm that made her heart stutter because it was not the sharp rap of a fellow servant, but something more hesitant, more deliberate. She opened the door to find a young footman she barely knew standing in the corridor, with a candle that cast dancing shadows across his nervous face, and he delivered his message in a whisper that barely carried across the threshold. The Duke requested her presence in his private study immediately, and Eleanor felt her world tilt on its axis because she had hoped to avoid this confrontation, had planned to disappear like morning mist before explanations became necessary, but she could not refuse a direct summons from the master of the house, and so she followed the footman through silent corridors where even the usual creaks and settling sounds of the old manor seemed to hold their breath. The Duke's study was lit only by the dying fire in the hearth, flames casting shifting patterns of light and shadow across the book-lined walls and the massive desk where she had dusted and cleaned 1,000 times, and the Duke stood at the window with his back to her, his tall figure silhouetted against the grey promise of dawn beyond the glass, and the silence stretched between them like a physical thing, taut and trembling with the weight of all that had remained unspoken for so long, until finally he spoke without turning, his voice low and rough, as though the words cost him something precious. "I know who you are." Eleanor's breath left her body in a rush, and the room seemed to spin around her as those 4 words shattered the careful illusion she had maintained for 3 years, and she grasped the back of a chair to steady herself, while her mind raced through denials and explanations that died unspoken because there was something in his voice that suggested denial would be pointless, that he possessed knowledge rather than suspicion, certainty rather than speculation. He turned to face her then, and the firelight revealed an expression that was not the anger or disgust she had feared, but something far more complex, a mixture of understanding and sadness and determination that she could not begin to pass. And he moved closer with steps that were careful and measured, as though approaching something fragile that might shatter at too sudden a movement, and his voice, when he continued, carried a gentleness that made tears burn behind her eyes. "I have known for months, Eleanor Grey, daughter of Baron Thomas Grey. I recognized you despite the years and the servant's dress and the way you have tried to make yourself invisible, because I visited your father's estate on business matters when you were but 15, and I watched you in the gardens with your mother, saw you laughing over books in the library, observed the grace and intelligence that marked you even then as exceptional. Eleanor could not speak, could not move, could not do anything but stare at him, while his words rewrote everything she had believed about her time at Ashworth Manor, transforming months of careful anonymity into an elaborate pretense that had existed only in her own mind, and she felt exposed and vulnerable in ways that went beyond the revelation of her identity, because if he had known all along, then every interaction between them took on new meaning. Every glance and word and moment of connection had occurred under circumstances entirely different from what she had imagined. The Duke continued speaking, his words falling like stones into the still pool of her shock. "I said nothing because you needed safety, and I would not deny you that refuge. You needed time to heal from your family's tragedy, and I would not rob you of that peace. And perhaps I needed time as well to understand what I felt when I saw you again, and be certain that my regard was not mere pity for your circumstances or guilt that I had failed to help your father when the scandal broke, and to know with absolute certainty that what has grown in my heart these past months is real and lasting and worthy of the risk I am about to take." And Eleanor finally found her voice, though it emerged as barely more than a whisper, asking what risk he meant, what danger he courted, and the Duke's expression softened into something that looked almost like hope tempered by fear, and he answered that he risked his heart by offering it to her, risked society's censure by acknowledging his feelings for someone the world would deem unsuitable, risked everything that mattered by asking a question to which he did not know the answer. If the barriers of class and circumstance did not exist, if they stood as simply man and woman rather than Duke and Maid, what would her heart tell her? And Eleanor felt the question settle over her like a weight too great to bear, because it demanded honesty she had never allowed herself, required her to acknowledge desires she had ruthlessly suppressed, asked her to imagine possibilities she had deemed too dangerous, even to contemplate in the privacy of her own thoughts. The Duke's voice continued to fill the firelit study with revelations that rewrote Eleanor's understanding of everything that had passed between them these long months. And he spoke of the reasons he had remained silent about her identity, explaining that she had arrived at Ashworth Manor with such evident wounds that he could not bring himself to expose her vulnerability, that she had needed safety and sanctuary to heal from the devastation of her family's ruin, and he would not deny her that refuge, even as he recognized her, despite the servant's dress and the careful way she had made herself small and invisible, and he admitted with a rawness that made her heart ache that he had also needed time to understand his own feelings, to examine the regard that had grown in him and determine whether it was merely pity for her tragic circumstances or guilt that he had failed to intervene when her father's world collapsed, or whether it might be something deeper and more enduring and worthy of the risk such feelings entailed. Eleanor stood frozen in the center of the study while her mind struggled to absorb these confessions, and she felt fear mingling with confusion and disbelief. Because if he had known all along, then every interaction between them took on layers of meaning she had never imagined. Every small kindness and brief conversation had occurred while he carried knowledge she thought hidden, and beneath the tumult of these revelations stirred something more dangerous still. A fragile hope she dared not acknowledge, because hope had proven a cruel companion in the years since her family's disgrace. Hope had led only to disappointment and pain, and the necessity of building walls around her heart to survive. The Duke moved closer with careful steps, as though approaching something precious that might shatter, and the firelight caught the planes of his face and revealed an expression so tender it nearly undid her, and he spoke of his growing regard for her, confessing that her quiet strength had become essential to him in ways he struggled to articulate, that he had watched her transform the cold grandeur of Ashworth Manor, not through dramatic gestures, but through countless small acts of care and attention. The way she arranged flowers in rooms no one but servants would see, the gentleness with which she treated elderly Mrs. Dalton when the housekeeper's joints pained her, the books she returned to their proper places in the library with a reverence that spoke of genuine love for the knowledge they contained. And these accumulated observations had painted a portrait of a woman whose worth had nothing to do with title or position, but everything to do with the content of her character and the quality of her heart. He acknowledged then the impossibility of their situations, speaking with painful honesty about the barriers of class and reputation that stood between them like walls built over centuries of rigid social hierarchy, and he did not pretend these obstacles were insignificant or easily overcome, and did not offer false assurances that love alone could conquer the world's cruelty and judgment. But instead, he posed a question that hung in the air between them, trembling with possibility and danger. If those barriers did not exist, if they stood before each other as simply man and woman, stripped of all the accidents of birth and circumstance that separated Duke from Maid, what would her heart tell her? What truth would emerge if she allowed herself to speak without fear of consequence or consideration of propriety? Eleanor opened her mouth to answer, but no words came, because the question was too vast, too terrifying in its implications, asking her to acknowledge desires she had ruthlessly suppressed and imagine possibilities she had deemed too dangerous even to contemplate in the privacy of her own thoughts, and she felt the weight of her mother's teachings about knowing one's place and accepting one's station, warring with the memory of her father's voice, speaking of courage and authenticity before the darkness took in him, and she stood paralyzed between these opposing forces, while the Duke waited with an expression that mingled hope and resignation. And finally she shook her head, not in negation but in overwhelm, and without a word she turned and fled the study, as she had fled the garden folly, leaving him standing alone in the dying firelight, with his question unanswered, and the space between them charged with all the things that remained unspoken but could no longer be denied. Eleanor fled the study without answering, and the days that followed became a torment of avoidance and endless internal argument, as she moved through her duties with mechanical precision, while her mind replayed the Duke's words in an endless loop, examining each phrase and inflection for meanings she might have missed or misunderstood, and she arranged her schedule to minimize any possibility of encountering him, taking her meals at odd hours and volunteering for tasks in the farthest corners of the manor where he would have no reason to venture. Yet even in her self-imposed exile, she felt his presence like a weight pressing against her consciousness. Knew somehow when he passed through corridors she had just vacated, sensed his restlessness in the quality of silence that settled over the household in the late hours when he should have been sleeping, but was instead pacing his chambers or standing at windows watching darkness give way to dawn. Mrs. Dalton observed the changes in both Eleanor and the Duke with her characteristic perception, noting how Eleanor had grown pale and distracted, how she jumped at unexpected sounds and lost herself in contemplation while polishing silver until the metal gleamed like mirrors, and the Duke had become equally altered, more withdrawn than usual, his legendary focus scattered so that he left correspondence unfinished and meetings with his steward abbreviated, and the housekeeper said nothing directly, but her concerned glances spoke volumes, conveying both sympathy and warning in the way only someone who had witnessed decades of human folly could manage. Eleanor wrestled with warring impulses that tore at her with equal force, desire battling duty and possibility, warring with impossibility, until she felt she might fragment under the pressure of choosing between them, and she recalled her mother's teachings about knowing one's place in the grand hierarchy of society, remembered the bitter lessons her mother had delivered in those final months before grief consumed her, the warnings about the cruelty of hoping for what could never be, and the necessity of accepting one's station with grace rather than railing against immutable truths. Yet beneath these remembered admonishments stirred other memories equally powerful, her father's voice speaking of courage and authenticity before the darkness took him, his insistence that a life lived in fear of judgment was no life at all, that sometimes the greatest act of bravery was simply allowing oneself to want what seemed impossible. One evening, as twilight painted the windows purple and gold, Eleanor found herself drawn to the library where so much had begun, where she had first noticed the Duke's unexpected gentleness with ancient texts and his habit of leaving markers in volumes he intended to return to, and she moved through the familiar space, touching books she had dusted countless times, running her fingers along spines embossed with gold lettering, standing in the exact spot where the Duke positioned his chair when he worked late into the night, and for just a moment she allowed herself to imagine a different life, one where she belonged in this room not as a servant maintaining its splendor, but as someone with equal claim to its knowledge and beauty, someone who might sit beside the Duke, discussing the ideas contained in these volumes, rather than merely preserving the physical objects that housed them, and the fantasy was so vivid and so painful that she almost did not hear the door open, almost missed the moment when the Duke entered and stopped just across the threshold, and when she turned to face him, neither of them spoke because words seemed inadequate to the moment, and the air between them trembled with accumulated longing that had been building through months of small moments and careful distances, through late-night encounters over tea trays and brief exchanges in rain-soaked gardens, through all the things they had felt but never acknowledged until that night in his study, when he had laid his heart bare and asked a question she still could not answer. And now they stood in silence while the last light faded from the windows and the library filled with shadows that softened the edges of everything, transforming the space into something suspended between reality and dream, where perhaps impossibilities might become briefly possible. The Duke broke the silence that had stretched between them in the shadowed library, and his voice when he spoke carried a quality of firm resolve, tempered with unexpected vulnerability, and he told Eleanor that he had made a decision in the days since their last conversation, that he had examined his heart and his conscience, and determined a course of action that honored both his feelings and her freedom, and he explained with careful precision that he would not pursue marriage with any of the noble candidates. His mother continued to parade before him, that he would face the Dowager Duchess's fury and society's judgment and all the consequences that would follow such a refusal. But he hastened to add that he was not making this choice as leverage to pressure Eleanor or as a means of binding her to him through obligation or guilt. Rather, he wanted her to know with absolute certainty that she need not fear his expectations or feel trapped by his regard for her. He moved closer as he spoke, and the dying light from the windows caught the planes of his face and revealed an expression of such earnest humility that it took her breath away, and he continued in a voice that trembled slightly with the weight of what he was offering, saying that if she wished to leave Ashworth Manor to start fresh, somewhere untainted by these complicated feelings, he would provide excellent references that would open doors anywhere in England, and he would ensure she had means sufficient to establish herself safely and comfortably in whatever new life she chose to build, and if instead she wished to remain at Ashworth Manor in her current position, he would respect that boundary absolutely and without resentment, would school himself to interact with her only as master to servant, and would never again impose his feelings upon her or make her uncomfortable with unwanted attention. Then his voice dropped lower still and took on a quality that made her heart ache with its mixture of hope and resignation, and he said that if by some chance she might envision a future that defied convention and social expectation, if she could imagine building something together that transcended the arbitrary barriers of rank and station, then he would spend whatever time proved necessary courting her properly, earning her trust and affection through patient demonstration of his character and intentions, and he would not rush or pressure or assume anything, but would let her set every boundary and determine every step of whatever relationship might develop between them. The humility embedded in this offering moved Eleanor more profoundly than grand romantic gestures ever could have done, because he was not demanding or assuming or wielding his power and position to override her agency. Instead, he was making himself vulnerable and placing his heart in her hands and trusting her to handle it with care. Whether she chose to accept it or return it to him with gentle refusal, and something cracked open inside her chest where she had kept her own feelings locked away behind walls of fear and self-protection. And for the first time since that night in his study, when he had asked what her heart would tell her if barriers did not exist, Eleanor allowed herself to speak the truth that had been growing in her despite every attempt to uproot it. She told him haltingly at first, and then with increasing confidence, that she too had been fighting feelings she had believed forbidden and dangerous, that she had tried to maintain proper distance and remind herself daily of all the reasons why any attachment between them was impossible and foolish and doomed to bring only pain. Yet despite these efforts, he had invaded her thoughts until she could not perform the simplest task without wondering what he might think of it, could not read a passage in a book without imagining discussing it with him, could not witness beauty in the gardens or the changing seasons without wishing he stood beside her to share the observation. She described how his rare smiles had become treasures she hoarded in memory, how she found herself listening for his footsteps in corridors and timing her movements to increase the chance of brief encounters she could pretend were accidental, how the nights when she brought him tea had become both torment and joy, because being near him fed a hunger that could never truly be satisfied by such inadequate morsels of connection, and she admitted with a vulnerability that matched his own that she had been terrified, not just of discovery or dismissal, but of this very moment when she might have to choose between the safety of denial and the dangerous possibility acknowledging what lived in her heart. And now that the moment had arrived, she found herself trembling, not with fear, but with something that felt remarkably like relief. They began a courtship that existed in the margins of ordinary life, woven from stolen moments and whispered conversations that transformed the manor's familiar spaces into territories of shared intimacy and discovery, and those first weeks unfolded like the careful opening of a rare book whose pages might crumble if handled too roughly, each encounter precious and fragile, and laden with the knowledge that what they were building defied every convention that governed their world. The library became their sanctuary in the deepest hours of night, when the household slept, and even the most vigilant servants had surrendered to exhaustion, and there among the leather-bound volumes and the scent of old paper and beeswax candles, they discussed everything from philosophy to poetry, from the political treatises that lined the Duke's shelves to the romantic novels Eleanor confessed to reading in secret during her brief moments of leisure, and Sebastian listened to her opinions with the same serious attention he gave to correspondence from Parliament, never dismissing her thoughts as those of an uneducated servant, but engaging with her ideas as though they came from an intellectual equal, which in truth they did despite society's insistence otherwise. He began teaching her Latin during these midnight sessions, pulling down his own childhood primers and guiding her through declensions and conjugations, with a patience that revealed how much he had longed for someone with whom to share the knowledge he had accumulated in isolation, and their hands would brush as they bent over ancient texts together, fingers touching as he pointed out particular constructions or she turned pages, and these small physical contacts carried a charge that made Eleanor's breath catch and brought color to Sebastian's usually pale complexion, proof that desire lived alongside intellectual communion in what was growing between them. As spring deepened into early summer, they extended their meetings to include walks in the gardens at dawn, before the household properly woke, moving through paths still heavy with dew, while birds announced the coming day, and mist rose from the ornamental lake, like something from a fairy story. And during these walks, Eleanor shared memories of her childhood before tragedy struck, describing the small estate where she had grown up with parents who loved each other genuinely despite their arranged marriage, recalling her father's library, which had been modest compared to the Duke's but filled with books he actually read rather than merely displayed, and the flower garden her mother had tended personally rather than leaving entirely to servants. And as she spoke of these lost things, Sebastian heard both grief and fondness in her voice, understanding that she mourned not just her family, but the version of herself who had existed before shame and necessity transformed her into someone invisible. In turn, Sebastian revealed his own loneliness with a candor that surprised them both, describing how he had inherited the dukedom at 19 when his father died suddenly, how he had been thrust into responsibilities for which his expensive education had not truly prepared him, forced to navigate political intrigues and manage vast properties and make decisions that affected hundreds of people while still barely more than a boy himself. And he spoke of the isolation that came with his position, the way people either feared him or sought to use him but rarely approached him as simply a human being worthy of genuine connection. And Eleanor understood then that beneath his cold exterior lay someone who had been lonely for far longer than she had, someone who had built walls not from cruelty but from self-protection, and this recognition deepened her feelings from attraction into something more profound, a desire not just to be with him but to ease the burdens he carried and share the weight of a life that had been solitary for too long. They discovered unexpected commonalities as these conversations accumulated, like deposits of sediment forming solid ground beneath their feet, both shaped by loss and premature responsibility, both seeking authenticity in a world built on pretense and performance, both longing for partnership rather than the transactional relationships their respective positions typically afforded, and their connection evolved beyond the initial spark of attraction into genuine friendship and intellectual communion, the kind of rapport that made silence comfortable and disagreement productive rather than threatening. And yet, even as their relationship deepened and took on the qualities of true partnership, the shadow of impossible circumstances hung over everything they built together, because what future could they truly construct when society deemed their union unthinkable and the practical obstacles seemed insurmountable. And this question haunted them both during moments of particular happiness, turning joy bittersweet with the knowledge that loving each other might not prove sufficient to overcome the world's cruelty and the inexorable machinery of social expectation that ground down those who dared defy it. Crisis arrived on a grey morning in late summer when the Dowager Duchess summoned the entire household to the grand drawing-room and announced with barely concealed triumph that she had secured an engagement between her son and Lady Constance Worthing, daughter of the Earl of Pembroke, a match she proclaimed would unite two of England's most distinguished families and secure the Ashworth line's political influence for generations to come, and the household staff exchanged glances of surprise while Sebastian stood rigid near the windows, his jaw clenched and his hands fisted at his sides, and Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face as the full implications crashed over her like a wave breaking against cliffs. The Dowager Duchess explained, with saccharine sweetness, that she had taken the liberty of arranging everything during Sebastian's recent distraction, had negotiated terms with Lord Pembroke, had secured agreements regarding properties and dowries, had even set a date for the wedding in 3 months' time, and she had done all this leveraging social obligations. Sebastian could not easily refuse, and calling in debts the late Duke had incurred which bound his son to certain political alliances, and she concluded by saying that the formal announcement would appear in the London papers within days, and that Lady Constance and her family would arrive at Ashworth Manor the following week to begin preparations. Sebastian erupted with fury Eleanor had never witnessed before, his carefully maintained composure shattering as he raged against his mother's machinations and demanded to know how she dared arrange his life without consultation. But the Dowager Duchess remained unmoved and pointed out coldly that she had every right as his mother and as someone who understood duty far better than he apparently did, and she reminded him that the announcement had already been made public, that refusing now would humiliate Lady Constance, who was entirely innocent and had accepted the proposal in good faith, that breaking such a high-profile engagement would create scandal that would damage not just the Ashworth name, but also destroy a young woman's reputation and prospects. And Sebastian fell silent because he knew with sickening certainty that his mother had trapped him perfectly, had used his own sense of honor and responsibility as weapons against him. Eleanor stood among the other servants and felt her world collapsing inward, felt the fragile happiness she and Sebastian had built during their stolen moments crumbling like sandcastles before an incoming tide, and she understood with painful clarity that this was how their story would end, not with mutual choice, but with duty and obligation, crushing whatever they had dared to dream possible. That night she waited until the household slept, and then made her way to the library where she knew Sebastian would be, found him standing at the windows, staring out at darkness, and when he turned to her, his expression held such anguish that she nearly lost her resolve. But she forced herself to speak the words she had rehearsed during the long evening, telling him that she released him from whatever understanding existed between them, that she could not be the reason he dishonored his obligations or caused pain to an innocent woman who had done nothing wrong except accept a proposal she believed genuine, and she said these things with as much steadiness as she could muster, though her voice shook and tears coursed down her face. Sebastian refused to accept this sacrifice, crossed the room in 3 strides, and took her hands in his, and said with fierce intensity that he would not marry Lady Constance and would not condemn himself to a lifetime with someone he did not love, while the woman who held his heart sacrificed herself on the altar of propriety, and they began to argue then, the first true conflict between them, born not of anger, but of love and desperation, and the impossible situation that trapped them both. Eleanor insisted that she would not destroy his life or his honor, would not be responsible for scandal that would follow him forever, or for the ruin of an innocent woman's reputation, reminded him that he had responsibilities to his name and his tenants and the political alliances that sustained the estate's prosperity. But Sebastian countered that a life without her was already destroyed, that he had lived in cold isolation before she brought warmth and meaning to his existence, and he would not return to that emptiness, regardless of what society demanded, and he spoke with such passion that Eleanor felt her resolve wavering, even as she knew her position was the morally correct one. They went back and forth, each trying to save the other from sacrifice, each insisting their own suffering mattered less than the other's future, until finally the argument dissolved into tears, and they found themselves holding each other in the middle of the library, clinging together as though physical proximity could somehow solve the problems that words could not. And they stood there for a long time while candles burned low and the night deepened around them, both knowing that love alone might not prove sufficient to overcome the world's cruelty, that sometimes caring deeply for someone meant letting them go, even when every fiber of your being screamed in protest, and the bitter knowledge that their happiness might be impossible hung between them like a spectre neither could banish. Sebastian spent the following 3 days locked in his study, barely sleeping, taking meals only when Mrs. Dalton insisted and left trays outside his door, and Eleanor moved through her duties like a ghost, performing tasks by rote while her mind remained trapped in that library embrace, both of them existing in a liminal space between hope and despair. And it was on the 4th morning that Sebastian emerged with eyes red from lack of sleep, but burning with fierce determination, and he immediately dispatched urgent letters to London solicitors and began a systematic examination of his father's papers and the estate's historical records, working with an intensity that alarmed the household staff, who had never seen their usually composed master in such a state of barely controlled energy. He had remembered something from years ago, a conversation overheard when he was barely 20 and newly titled "Whispers Among His Father's Old Associates" about the convenient timing of Baron Grey's disgrace, about rivals who had benefited substantially from the scandal, and Sebastian began pulling that thread with the methodical thoroughness he applied to everything, requesting documents from courts and banks, interviewing elderly retainers who remembered the events, hiring investigators to track down witnesses who had scattered in the years since the Baron's fall, and piece by piece he uncovered the ugly truth that Eleanor's father had been deliberately destroyed by men who coveted his modest but strategically located lands, and who had manufactured evidence of debts and improprieties that never actually existed. The proof came in the form of falsified ledgers and forged signatures, testimony from a clerk who had been paid to lie and whose conscience had troubled him for years, a correspondence between the conspirators that Sebastian's investigators discovered in an estate sale of papers belonging to one of the deceased plotters, and armed with this evidence, Sebastian moved with swift and merciless efficiency to dismantle the lies that had destroyed an innocent family, using his considerable influence to have the case reviewed by magistrates, leveraging his political connections to ensure the matter received proper attention, and within 6 weeks he had secured official vindication for Baron Grey, the restoration of the family's honor, the recovery of properties that had been seized and sold, and the establishment of Eleanor as the legitimate heir to her father's title and the now restored estate. He did all this without telling Eleanor what he was attempting, partly because he feared failure and could not bear to raise hopes that might be crushed, partly because he wanted the gift to be complete when he presented it, but mostly because he understood that he was not doing this to make her his equal in society's eyes, since she had always been his equal in every way that truly mattered, but rather to remove the weapons that society would use against them, to eliminate the arguments about class disparity that his mother and others would employ to condemn their union. And when he finally summoned Eleanor to his study on a bright September afternoon and laid before her the documents proving her father's innocence and her own restored position, she stared at the papers for a long moment as though unable to comprehend their meaning, and then the tears came. Great wrenching sobs for the father who had died in exile, believing himself dishonored, for the mother who had perished of grief and shame, for the years Eleanor herself had spent hiding from a disgrace that had never been deserved, and Sebastian held her while she wept, understanding that these tears were necessary, that she needed to mourn properly for what had been stolen, and to rejoice for the justice that came too late to save her parents, but in time to free her from the weight of unearned shame. When the storm of emotion finally subsided, Sebastian took both her hands in his and asked her properly, not as duke to servant but as man to woman, whether she would consent to be his wife, and Eleanor looked at him with eyes still wet from tears and said, "Yes," said it clearly and without hesitation, and they sat together in that study where so much of their story had unfolded and planned how they would navigate the challenges that still remained, knowing that the Dowager Duchess would bluster and object but unable to argue against a match between Duke and Baroness, without revealing herself as caring more for political advantage than her son's happiness, and knowing too that Lady Constance, when approached with honesty and the offer of a generous settlement, might well be relieved to escape a marriage to a man whose heart belonged elsewhere. And indeed, when Sebastian met with Lord Pembroke and his daughter and explained the situation with complete candour, Lady Constance surprised everyone by laughing and admitting she had accepted the engagement only from duty, and had been dreading a lifetime shackled to a cold manner and a husband who looked at her with polite indifference, and she wished Sebastian well and accepted the financial arrangements he offered, and departed Ashworth Manor with evident relief, leaving the Dowager Duchess furious but defeated, unable to prevent a union that society would find entirely appropriate between two titled individuals, even if she recognized that her son had outmaneuvered her completely, and that the balance of power in the household had shifted irrevocably away from her influence. 2 years had passed since the autumn morning when Eleanor Grey became the Duchess of Ashworth, and the manor that had once felt like a mausoleum of cold stone and colder silences had transformed into something warmer, something that hummed with genuine contentment rather than merely the efficient operation of a grand estate. And on a golden afternoon in late September, Eleanor walked through gardens she had redesigned, with Sebastian at her side, her hand resting lightly on the swell of her belly where their first child grew. And they discussed plans for the tenant cottages that needed repair before winter, and the school they hoped to establish in the village, speaking as true partners who had learned that love deepened not through grand gestures, but through the daily choice to face life's challenges together. The gardens bloomed with roses Eleanor had selected for their fragrance rather than their formal appearance, and the rigid parterres of the Dowager Duchess's era had given way to meandering paths where one might walk and think and find unexpected beauty around each turn, and Sebastian paused by a bench they had placed beneath an ancient oak and drew Eleanor down beside him, his hand covering hers in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing, and she leaned against his shoulder and felt the profound peace of being exactly where she belonged. Mrs. Dalton now served as Eleanor's most trusted advisor, the former housekeeper having become a dear friend who helped manage the household with the same competence she had always possessed, but now with warmth and laughter woven through the daily routines, and the rigid hierarchies that had once defined every interaction had softened into relationships built on mutual respect, and former servants attended informal gatherings in the drawing room where Eleanor and Sebastian hosted evenings of music and conversation, and the manor had become a place where worth was measured not by title or birth, but by character and kindness. As evening approached, they returned to the library where so much of their story had unfolded, and Sebastian settled Eleanor into the chair near the fireplace and took up a volume of poetry they had been reading together, and his voice filled the room with gentle cadence, while firelight played across the books and maps and all the familiar objects that had witnessed their journey from Duke and Maid to husband and wife. And Eleanor closed her eyes and listened, and thought how strange and wonderful it was that the place where she had once worked in fearful invisibility had become her sanctuary, and the man whose cold demeanor had once terrified her now read to her with such tenderness that she sometimes wept from the simple beauty of being loved. Dear listener, there are truths in this story that transcend the particular circumstances of Eleanor and Sebastian, truths about patience and the courage required to look beyond surfaces and see the worth that society often obscures. For how many times do we dismiss people based on their station or their circumstances, failing to recognize that extraordinary depth and beauty may hide beneath unremarkable exteriors? And how often do we allow fear of judgment or convention to prevent us from reaching toward authentic connection with those our world tells us we should ignore? Eleanor and Sebastian's love succeeded not because it conquered all obstacles through sheer force of passion, but because they both possessed the patience to let their connection develop naturally, the humility to recognize their own vulnerabilities, and the courage to choose each other despite every voice that counseled them to surrender to impossibility. And in this there is wisdom for all of us, for the most transformative loves are often those that require us to question the arbitrary boundaries society constructs, to recognize that worth cannot be measured by title or wealth or position, but only by the content of character and the capacity for genuine care. May you find the courage to look past surfaces and see clearly. May you have patience enough to let love develop in its own time rather than rushing toward conclusions. and may you discover in unexpected places the connections that will transform your life, as Eleanor and Sebastian transformed each other's, and may you rest well tonight knowing that authentic love, when nurtured with patience and protected with courage, can indeed transcend any boundary the world erects against it. And if you have found meaning in this story of love that bloomed in impossible circumstances, please subscribe to Duchess Diaries for more tales of hearts that refuse to be constrained by convention and souls that find each other across every divide.